Lia Garvin, welcome to Partnering Leadership. I'm thrilled to have you in this conversation with me.
Thank you so much. So excited to be here.
I'm excited, can't wait to talk about Unstuck, Reframe Your Thinking to free yourself from the patterns and people that hold you back. Before we get to that, Leah, would love to know whereabouts you grew up and how your upbringing impacted the kind of person you've become.
Yeah. So I grew up in the Bay Area, first in San Francisco. One of the few San Francisco natives, I think, still living in the Bay Area, and then was in Marin for the North Bay for high school. And I think I it's an interesting question. I think, I had um mom that worked, both parents really uh focused on making sure that we had everything that we need, that we had the support, that just really, I would say, very, very lucky to have a lot of support from my family as I grew up. And it's interesting, as I reflected later working in tech, I think being in the Bay Area sparked, even though it was, gotta say, before all the tech stuff was going on, definitely pre all the big boom that came in the later 2000s. But I think being exposed to a lot of that early on kind of sparked an interest in working in tech. But it's funny that I think I experienced a lot more of the imposter syndrome and kind of these feelings a lot later, I think, because I had such supportive parents around my work and what I was doing, and kind of go try anything you want, and go after it. And um, it kind of hit me when I had entered the workforce, like, wait a second, that's not how it goes. Like, this isn't the situation. And so it's really privileged to say that. Absolutely. And I think it also gave me a real passion around changing that for people, that we that everybody should feel like they can do it, and they can be successful working in any environment. And I think it ended up shaping my passion around helping build inclusive and effective teams, and making sure that women are really set up for success in the workforce, and really people from any background are set up for success, and have equitable opportunities. So yeah, I think definitely appreciate my family for infusing that into me, and creating just enough, like, wait a second, this is not okay, not the way it should be, once I was really in that experience.
So then when was it, Leah, that you realized that what I'm feeling is imposter syndrome? So there's
Yeah.
something wrong with this feeling.
Yeah. It's funny. I think I say in my book, I didn't have imposter syndrome before I started working in tech, but I had it later that afternoon, like my first day. So my first day working in a large tech company, I was at orientation. I sat down at a table, and a man sat down at the table. It was like, big round tables. And he said, let me guess, are you an administrative assistant, or are you in marketing? Literally said that to me, like, oh, hello, nice to meet you too. And I was like, what the heck is this? And I didn't really, it hit me like, wait a second. Okay, this is going to be a question that comes up a lot. And as a non-engineer, it sort of planted the seed, unfortunately, like from the very first day, that there was kind of a lot of biases and assumptions around what I was here to do, and what I should be doing, and the roles that women are in tech, most of which are very, very incorrect assumptions and biases. And so I worked in program management, and I was a business analyst at the time. And it's sort of like it was a punch in the gut, that it took a really long time to really think about, well, how do I demonstrate my value, and what am I bringing here as a non-engineer into a tech organization? I think, when I started in tech in almost 10 years ago, there were less and less roles that were not engineering. And now I think it's gotten a lot more. There's tons of different kinds of roles, real estate, like, I mean, you could work in health, and you could be a chef, right? All sorts of things. But at the time, it was like you're an engineer, or you're some other kind of like less role. And that was tough.
And the interesting thing is, Leah, that punch in the gut comes, and it comes more so in many instances for women in certain roles than it does
Yeah.
for others.
Yeah.
The question is what we do with that punch in the gut. That's why I love your book Unstuck, in that there is an ability that we have to reframe that thinking, because all of these years later, tech has been a big advocate, and tech companies have been a big advocate for D&I initiatives and bringing everyone along. But still, there are elements, including the experience you talk about in your orientation, that make it harder for people to be able to prove
Yeah.
themselves. So, what what do people need to do when their environment ends up keeping them stuck and pushing them down?
Yeah, I love this question because this is something I talk a lot about, that there are a ton of factors out there that make it so much harder. And that, getting unstuck and reframing, which is the strategy I talk about, it's not about ignoring those things or look on the bright side, chin up. Like it's no, it's about recognizing these are very, very real obstacles that are even more difficult with intersectional dimensions, race, disability, language. There's so many things that can make it so much harder. And I think, I only experienced, one dimension of that from the gender aspect. I think as I, learned more and more and supported more folks and just did more work around DEI, just to see like that, how to help people understand that it just gets more and more and more layered and more difficult. And I think what I like to talk about is recognizing this is the context. And so it's about recognizing, hey, these things are going to be harder. These things are going to exist. These are going to be frustrations. These are going to be beliefs other people have that we have to push against. And as we're pushing to change the system, we also want to recognize when we are attaching to those beliefs and then believing them they are true, like, women aren't technical or something like that, right? Like, some really, false stereotype bias that um that it's not enough just to say, oh well, I'm technical, I don't believe that. If my colleagues believe that, right, there is still going to have to be a feeling of having to prove myself, but it means I don't say I'm going to believe that and then not pursue this interest that I have, or not really build the skills to advocate for myself or talk about my work or all the other themes that I talk about in my book. And so I think, you know, one of the big, I think, limiting beliefs that a lot of women that I've worked with myself had is like, don't talk about your work, don't show off, just, keep your head down, good work gets noticed. And that belief just serves to keep our work further invisible and not noticed. I mean, I think, but that's something that a lot of us have been told. And when we did talk about our work, we kind of got slapped on the wrist, like, hey, like, who are you to sort of stand out? And so you're struggling with this thing where you kind of believe it and like the world is telling you to. So what do you do? Well, you have to try different perspectives and try different approaches. And so that is how, I work with folks on navigating these things, is recognizing all these things are true. It's really, really difficult to be, a woman in the workplace, a woman of multiple identities in the workplace. And here's how we're going to move forward.
I love that perspective, Leah, somewhat to Stoic philosophy, in that there are aspects that we can't control. There are systemic issues that need to be addressed. That's understood. That said, there are things that we can do, and reframing can help us free
Yeah.
ourselves from those patterns. Now, one of the interesting things, Leah, is your book took me a lot longer to read than the usual book, because I found myself half the time cracking up for a few minutes, including on the cover of the book, where you say, I'm stuck, reframe your thinking to free yourself from patterns and people that hold you back. And on the bottom, spoiler alert, some of these people are you. So all throughout the book, you have these little side blurbs and conversations where sometimes I would find myself cracking up and putting the book down laughing, because it's so true that sort of as if you've got the back of your mind, that thinking that's going on there, speaking at the same time as the mouth is speaking.
Yeah, exactly. And I love that you love that. I mean, I think that's what made the book so fun to write, was it was essentially my, like, my inner monologue, which can be, serious and silly at the same time. And so I was like, you know what, I'm just going to put it all in there. And like you say, there's so many things that are either kind of absurd or ridiculous or frustrating, that we do have this inner dialogue that we kind of sometimes have to keep a little bit quiet, but it's still there. And so I wanted to make sure it was represented.
It was, and I really enjoyed it because it's a business book with a lot of value. At the same time, I had a smile on my face the entire time, and a few times really cracked up and had to put the book to the side as I was laughing. And you talk about reframing and 12 important reframes that we can go through to get unstuck. You address one of them. I want to go deeper. I want to go deeper into a few of them. You mentioned reframing your value, which I find also in my coaching work with including senior executives, including CEOs that are women. A lot of times women have a harder time with it. The desire for being humble, which I think is important,
Mhm.
and that humility keeps them from advocating for themselves and marketing themselves and
Yeah.
talking about the value they're bringing. So, how can we reframe value in a way that is not inappropriate? It's not too much. No one likes someone who is consistently bragging. What is the
Yeah.
right way to reframe value?
Yeah. So I think great question. To start with, well, what is reframing? Because I think I don't know if I explained that really in depth yet. I mean, reframing is really the act of looking at a challenge or somewhere where you're stuck through a new perspective and saying, okay, well, how else can I look at this? And like you said, there's a perspective, I think a lot of times that we can adopt, which is, I shouldn't talk about myself. I shouldn't brag, like you said, or it'll just get noticed. And so another perspective on that is, okay, well, what would it look like to talk about it, right? Which is what you're asking. And so I think a few of the strategies that I think are really helpful. First is to really talk about, and I talk about this in the chapter about talking about your impact as well, is really connecting the dots between what you do, why it matters, and what value now it had for the organization. And so I think a lot of times we talk about one of those pieces and we're telling an incomplete story about what we're actually the value that we were able to deliver. And so, for example, um, like, yeah, I led this team through this big organizational change. That sort of is like what your job description was, right? That's not enough to demonstrate the value. And so I like to suggest folks tie a superpower, a real strength that you have. So, leveraging my, deep passion for building relationships and being able to connect with people and help people, bring vulnerability to the conversation. I was able to establish a process to drive a large scale organizational change that resulted in saving our company XYZ dollars in time. So now you're able to connect a series of things together. And I think if you start with like leveraging this superpower, you're talking about, it's like you didn't say, I'm really great at this thing or I made all this money, right? It's less about I did this, it's more about the thing that you brought. And I think the more we talk about the work, first and what we were able to deliver, the less it feels like personally like, am I bragging? Am I showing off? Is this too much? It's like, here's this value that I created, and this is the way I did it. So that's one way. I think the other thing I talk about in the book is really being mindful of not falling into what I call the fixer trap. And being a fixer is something where kind of like you roll up your sleeves and you can solve any problem and you can make sure everything gets done or figured out. Um, I think for many women, that's actually really celebrated throughout our upbringing and even in our early career. And then all of a sudden it's not celebrated. And it's like, why are you doing all this sort of like, either administrative or sort of execution or tactical work? And all of a sudden the script is flipped. And so I think when we look at how we define our value and we feel like, oh God, I'm in this fixer role, how am I going to break free of this? It's to help, teach people how to fish, right? Well, okay, here's a system that I created. Here you go. You can utilize this for next time to, plan this sort of team event or, figure out this kind of problem in the future. So I think that's how we can get out from under being a fixer, and also how to add value is to help elevate others, teach them how to problem solve, help them step up and be accountable. And then we're really creating a lot of long-term value there as well.
Yeah. So what I hear from you is, number one, the way you communicate the value that you bring makes a big difference. That's in
Yeah.
reframing the value. It's a little bit the way I think about when people share compliments or strengths with others. Without evidence, it can become insincere. It can sound like
Yeah.
flattery. That doesn't mean you should avoid it. It means there has to be reality to it, evidence to it, to support it. So it can be done well, and it should be done well. The other point I hear from you is the need for us to help develop rather than solve problems. That helps in reframing that value that the leaders bring.
Yeah, exactly. And I think well, how do we elevate others? And, is one way is to treat them like owners and give them the tools to step up. And so segue into the, the chapter about accountability. This is something that I talk a lot about. And in my work as an organizational consultant, do a ton of work with teams on is how do we reframe our relationship with accountability from thinking it's about blame and punishment and hierarchy and micromanagement. No, it's actually not any of those things. Accountability is about ownership and empowering people to step up. And so we can add a lot of value by, creating the structures for people to be accountable. And then when they step up as owners, everybody wins and people feel like, they can really rise to the occasion and take on, whatever they're faced with.
Now, with that accountability, also, Leah, I find perceptions play a role. So, we'd love to tie it into feedback. Feedback is
Mhm.
absolutely important. You talk about reframing feedback correctly. However, one of the challenges that I've seen in working with teams is that the feedback can also be extremely biased. So, our perceptions of how uh, a person with a certain background or a woman or a person of color should behave in a certain situation impacts the feedback. So, how can we solicit feedback, get the right feedback, but also be able to decipher the bias that sometimes goes into the feedback?
Yeah, and I've, like, rolled my eyes, like, 3 times as you were talking about, because 'cause I'm like, I think feedback is the hardest thing. I mean, I start the book with that because I think it's first and foremost, it's the foundation. Like, if we can't deal with feedback, we can't overcome any of these other challenges because we aren't able to take in the information that's in front of us. And so I think a few things. I mean, um you know, feedback is often looked at as, okay, this is a criticism or something people don't like about me or something I'm doing wrong. And that perspective is something that's going to make us dread feedback and be terrified of it. And if someone says, hey, can I give you some feedback? You're like, I'd rather just like never come back to work. And so that belief is already getting in our way. And so I think remembering that feedback's actually information, more so at the other person even than about us. So, and take for example, one colleague or manager might, love the way that you present information that's very detailed and very meticulous. Another person might say, just get to the point. I'm not even sure, like, why is there all this setup, right? And so I think a lot of times we can get feedback that differs very widely across each person or stakeholder or colleague. And if we attach to believing like, oh gosh, everything someone tells me I have to change about myself, we're just going to get thrashed around by everybody. And so instead saying, okay, all feedback that's shared is information, it's a data point. I'm going to collect all of that and examine, well, what really gets me, what should I sort of adopt or try out that will get me closer to where I want to get in my career, or will help me influence more, or deliver this work better in a different way, or help something land better. So that's the first thing. But I think with recognizing that there is so much bias in feedback, because I think a lot of times people believe, wrongly, that like if they think of something, they should say it to other people, which I don't think in general, I think should be reined in quite a bit. But like you said, there's beliefs about how certain people should be or are, and this is coming up a lot. I've seen, with Gen Z, right? Like sort of new ways of talking about, well, what's professional, what's casual, like all, and so this is only going to become more and more part of the conversation. And I think, for feedback givers, putting ourselves in check and asking, is this about the work or the personality? Is this about the behavior, or is this about the like a preference that I have? And does it really get in the way of, a job getting done or the work getting delivered? And this takes a lot of nuance between the what and the how. But I think we can, in organizations where they're focusing on, we want people's like how to be collaborative and inclusive. There can also, the flip side can be an over focus on, well, that's not how I would do it, and therefore it's wrong. So it's something to be really nuanced about. Now, if you're a receiver of biased feedback, again, as that's a really horrible situation to be in, and that can really shake your confidence. And it's the moment to remember, again, this is more about that other person and their beliefs that are, that need to be um changed and like it evolved and things, but it's not about you. It does not mean you cannot do something or should not do something. And I think if you have an opportunity to share feedback back to the person, I think that's a really important thing to do, and say, hey, that feedback really is coming across as a personality judgment. And let's talk about the work. Like, how did that get in the way from the work? And sometimes we're not comfortable having that conversation directly. So if you have a relationship with that person's manager, or feel comfortable escalating that, or the more that you can educate that other person. I know that it's not fair or okay that we have to educate someone else when there's been, when something has happened to us, but I think there is an opportunity to help, ensure that person doesn't repeat that behavior. So, to the extent that you feel comfortable, I think that can be a real opportunity to say, um, I just want to, like, tease apart. This is really about, this, not this. And um, I think the more in organizations that we teach people about what bias feedback sounds like, how it shows up, how to differentiate between, to really leave anything around personality or preferences really out of the conversation, the more we can help tackle this.
Yeah, and you mentioned the nuance a few times, Leah. That nuance is really important in soliciting and giving of the feedback. And one of the things I find is really important is that people's perceptions of the world is their reality. And
Yeah.
without getting this feedback, we are not able to get ourselves unstuck. So if
Yeah.
we are able to get more feedback from more people, then those patterns can help us get ourselves unstuck. Any
Yes.
one of those individual data points can be biased, or are data points that we might need to work on and coach the other person on. But getting
Yeah.
a lot of it and consistently can help us get unstuck, which is part of your point.
Exactly. And that's what I suggest with both, feeling like a really loud inner critic around feedback, or even imposter syndrome, is collect more data, right? As you just said, hey, there's a lot of perceptions that are out there, and the evidence typically shows us that we are doing a lot better of a job than our inner critic is giving us credit for. And if we only attach to one example that's more critical, and we believe, we throw away all the positive, it becomes really hard to recognize and appreciate the great work we're doing. And so I think, like you say, it's really important to collect a lot of data, and to ask for multiple perspectives. And and when asking for feedback, one huge life hack is to offer a specific thing you're working on. Like, plant a seed, not to just ask, hey, do you have any generalized feedback about me as a person? Like, I just would strongly suggest never to do that. But to say, hey, I'm working on my public speaking skills and I'm really trying to get tighter on the way I'm landing a message, or I'm working on making sure my meetings run smoothly. Can you keep an eye out for this? That is really a place where we can get really useful feedback that's around what we want feedback on, instead of like opening the floodgates, which, it's just not going to be good. I just think it's,
Uh, I
yeah,
love I love that point, Leah. Ask for a specific feedback from a person that you see as being credible in that area and you have a trusting relationship with. So to your point, if it is your speaking skills, you have a trusting relationship with someone, you believe they are a good speaker, so you ask their feedback on your speaking skills, then that
yeah,
by itself makes it a little easier to then be able to incorporate that feedback. Ask for the specific from a trusted resource that has some credibility in that specific area.
yeah, exactly. And again, if you receive, like, I've received feedback that, I'm too emotional. I think every woman has received that piece of feedback. And it's like, that's biased feedback. It's like, it's completely doesn't acknowledge that, every gender has emotions, and what is an emotional, it's acceptable. It's like, there's so many things wrong with that, and the kinds of feedback that I think that, like, when we hear that kind of thing, it can really shake us. Like, we say, oh, well, like, how many other people thought that? Did it get in the way of this and that and the other? And so I think, again, before we go into a sort of rabbit hole of feeling like, oh my God, like, even though this thing was biased, did it really harm me, me and my perception in some way, to collect more feedback? And I'll tell you, like, my what I have reframed from emotional to passionate, like, has really served me and become a superpower in my career. And I think, by soliciting more feedback and hearing from people that said, like, like, being animated and having an opinion and a perspective and channeling that into to helping people, like, why, like, that's not a bad thing at all. Like, it's something that's really, beneficial. And so, that's another reason to collect feedback when we're like, I don't know, like, is this something that's a problem or not? Similarly, like, I was not an engineer. I used to think, like, building technical skills was like like a development area that I actually needed to, like, go back to school. No, it was something that had no relevance to the direction I wanted to go. So that's an example of feedback that actually you can say, okay, well, that's not on the path of a place that I'm going. I don't need to develop in this area. Thank you, but no, thank you, and move on.
Yeah, and you start with it, and I think is extremely powerful and important. Without that feedback, we can't get ourselves unstuck. Now, there
Yes.
are other things we need to reframe, but feedback is really important. You also talk about reframing conflict and the fact that we need to change the stories that we tell. How can we change the stories in order to be able to reframe conflict to help us get unstuck?
Yeah. So I think, first we have to recognize that the thoughts that we're having are stories. And this can be the hardest thing, right, of all, is that we think something and we believe it's true because we feel it. So that's the first thing, is to say, hey, um, I'm upset, I'm frustrated, I'm sad, I'm disappointed. That's the feeling. Now, whatever happens after that is a story that I've added to that. And I know, Brene Brown talks about this in one of her books. I think she says the story I'm making up. Others call it the story I'm telling myself. I think it's taught in, like, Stanford graduate school of business as, like, in one of their course. It's very widely talked about as a tool um, to really catch that sort of story before it becomes a runaway train, before it becomes true. I think Crucial Conversations may talk about it as well. And so, to catch the story, we have to be tuned in to, well, what is the dialogue that we're having with ourselves? And I think this is also a tool I share. When How do I know when I'm even stuck? Well, what kinds of things are we saying to ourselves? And when I'm feeling down, what is my inner dialogue looking like? Am I talking in absolutes? This always happens, this never happens. Am I getting in a sort of why me sort of space? And when we can tune into that, we understand, well, what's actually going on. And so when we recognize, okay, I'm feeling frustrated, there's likely to be a story here. Um, just being honest with ourselves first and foremost, like, what is the analysis or the like conclusion I've jumped to based on the situation? So, I got passed up for this promotion, so I'm disappointed. That's the sort of situation. I'm feeling very disappointed, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling frustrated, I'm feeling like, screw this, I don't want to work here anymore, whatever I'm feeling. And then the story I'm telling myself is this. And there could be like an infinite number of stories you could tell yourself. On the really, really probably optimistic side, a story could be, ooh, great. I learned about the process and what I need to do for next time, and a couple of really exciting development areas, and I'm gearing up to go. That's not always the case, right? But on the farther side is like, I'll never be successful in this organization. No one sees my value. I'm not good enough. Everybody was right who told me I wasn't good enough. I should just quit. And like, I think there's like I said, there's an infinite number of stories we can tell ourselves and attach through there. And I would suggest, when we're in that zone, to explore and try on a series of stories and say, okay, based on this story, how do I want to move forward? And so I didn't even bring up conflict, I forgot, but but that's where I bring this up. When we're in a conflict with someone, let's say a colleague and I have a disagreement over how to approach something. That's the situation. I'm feeling frustrated. And the story I'm telling myself is, they don't respect me, they don't listen to me, they don't value me, right? This is where, we want to acknowledge how that story is driving how we're responding to that person. And if we are acting from the place of that story, it's going to be a lot different than when we said, ooh, this is a disagreement. I love rolling up my sleeves and like getting in there and disagreeing. This is so fun, right? Your whole approach is going to be different.
So, Leah, one of the steps is recognition of the story that we are telling ourselves. When you find yourself in situations like this, where the story that you're telling yourself is not a positive one, how do you reframe the story? It's really hard. When I think about it, it's usually a lot of times our minds gravitate toward the most negative versions of stories when there is a conflict, most especially if the relationship is not a positive relationship.
Yeah,
How can we reframe the story in order to be able to reframe the conflict?
absolutely. So I like to say it's one question. What outcome do I want? And we ask ourselves that question, the answer is often, so much more often, I just want to be able to work here and like have, a peaceful interaction. I just want to get this thing done. I just want to be able to move forward. I just want to like get through this. It's rarely to prove this person right, to get this person fired, to do this. It's usually like actually just kind of moving through it. I would say more often than not. And when we recognize that, even when we feel really, really frustrated or wronged, we see that can dictate how we want to move forward, as opposed to having to prove ourselves right. And so, in the book, I share an example of two colleagues that were friends, and then one became the manager of the other, and had to give feedback about the work. And I'll just say, I've seen that go poorly most times. So like, it's really hard to manage a former friend. That when the manager thought, well, what outcome do I want? It was actually to have a positive relationship with this new team member. It wasn't to, prove it to her that she was disrespecting her, or to, and I think in the flip side, the direct report would have said the same. Like, I just want this to go back to how it was. And so when we run into a conflict and we ask ourselves, what outcome do I want? Let that, provided it's hopefully in the direction of like resolution and moving forward, be the lens at which we approach our next step from, as opposed to driving out of that story.
Yeah, I love that perspective of having that outcome in focus, because a lot of times the when emotions take over, we end up going in directions that the outcome is not aligned with. So keeping that
Yeah.
outcome has a big impact on this. Now, another one of the reframes I would love to touch on is reframing of comparison. And I wonder, Leah, isn't comparison a basis for progress where I see people getting promotions, therefore I want to get a promotion too. So I work harder to get that promotion, or see people buying new cars, want that new car. So isn't comparison a basis for progress? Why and how then should we reframe comparison so it's healthy, not unhealthy?
Yeah. So I agree. I mean, I think comparison can be something that helps us feel a little bit of fuel to move forward and to keep, especially if we're ambitious, it can be, it can be a helpful driver in sports and different things, like for sure. I think where it becomes like a bit of a slippery slope and can be cause more harm is when we're comparing ourselves first to just kind of anything and everything, which I think has become really the case with a lot of things with social media, that we're kind of getting windows into too much information about other people, right? Like every move someone's making, everything they eat, where they're vacationing, what they bought, where we sort of create this false, like, like I'm not good enough, just even if it's stuff we never would have thought about, just because we're exposed to it. So I think there's an information overload that's creating new feelings of comparison in areas we never would have cared or thought about. So we're now in this like heightened sense of comparison, and with so much insight into other people's lives and work, there's a lot of desire to keep up with the Joneses and kind of have what other people have. And so, like you said, two examples, you know, really, seeing your colleagues and wanting to be kind of like, in that sort of achievement zone is one thing. Seeing someone got a car may drive you to do a different set of behaviors that end up not fulfilling, like, what was I even chasing? Was this even something I wanted? And so when we feel ourselves feeling this sense of FOMO, or fear of missing out, or this sense to want to keep up with the Joneses or comparing, um, I like to suggest people ask themselves two questions. And the first is, do I really want this? Right? Like I saw the car, I saw this, Paris trip someone went on, I saw this new house someone bought. Do I even want this thing? And to really be honest with ourselves and to say, like, I in my book I talk about a story like, do I want to go camping every weekend? Like, no, I don't want to go camping. I have to admit it, right? It's not me, but okay. So I've answered that. Now the second question is, well, what is it I actually want? And this is where we get what the real learning is, right? Okay, I didn't want the new car. I wanted to be able to, like, actually, spend the money I've earned on something that I feel really proud of. I want to be able to celebrate myself, or, I didn't want to go camping. I want to be a little bit more adventurous. I don't want to just be working all the time and never getting out there. Or, I saw someone buy a new house. That's not what I wanted. I want to really plant my roots somewhere, or what, when we figure out what we actually want, now we have a goal that's meaningful and there's an intrinsic piece that we can attach to. And that's the most important thing, I think, um, to both overcome comparison, but also to set a goal that we actually will pursue and have resilience against when something goes wrong, is that there's a real motivator there. And so I think a lot of times when we compare ourselves and we ask ourselves that first question, like, do I really want this? We might say, yes, I do want this, but at least we've asked ourselves and we say, okay, now I can figure out, okay, how do I want to get that? What is it going to look like? We can make a plan around it as opposed to just being on autopilot. Like, I want to like hit like every single thing I see, give me more of it, because that can create a real sense of a not enoughness.
Yeah, it's a meaningful way to get unstuck. If anything, the unhealthy comparison gets us more stuck. I had
Yeah,
a
exactly.
conversation with Patrick McGinnis, who came up with the term FOMO, and he talks about the fact that one of the most pictured sites in Russia, it's actually a toxic waste dump, but it looks beautiful in pictures. So people take selfies and it looks glamorous, it looks gorgeous. So you look at the picture and say, oh my God, I wish I was there.
Yeah.
So there is so much of that happening where we are comparing our mundane lives with the curated highlights
Yeah.
of people smiling in front of the most beautiful sights. That is the unhealthy comparison that
Yeah.
gets us more stuck. There can be healthy comparison
Yeah.
if we do it with intention of where we want to end up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, let's be honest, anybody listening with kids, any picture with the toddler smiling, there's like 200 before that where they're like crying and throwing a tantrum. I mean, it hit me before I had kids. I had a colleague and I was like, "Oh, that what I saw him on Instagram that the wedding you went to looked awesome. Like I saw you and your family." He's like, "Oh my God, that was the worst day of my life." Like, like my two kids were screaming. My wife was yelling at me. We were like, didn't talk the whole car ride home, and you saw this one photo and you're like, oh, their life's so great. So you have no idea what happens behind the scenes.
Leah, I'm cracking up because we just had a wonderful family vacation at Cancun. One of the most beautiful pictures has a beautiful background, blue swimming pool. Everything is like, it's gorgeous. But it was right after my girls, I have a 12-year-old and 15-year-old. They were at it. They were like really fighting with each other. And my wife and I were like, okay, just one picture. Take a picture, smile. So they have this beautiful smile. We're taking this picture.
Yeah.
So anyone that looks at that picture is like, oh my God, this is the most serene environment. There was a huge fight right before it and a huge fight right after it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so we have to just take it with a grain of salt, because like, because everything has a filter on it, a lens on it. And, if we know what we really want, what the motivator is, that's the thing to focus on.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, your book has a lot of great thoughts around the reframes on how to get unstuck, and a lot of fun side tidbits, including I cracked up so hard when someone tells me to look on the bright side. I want to punch them in the face, and it's so true, Leah, because there is so much negative sometimes where we don't want to be told to look on the bright side. But we do need to be able to get ourselves unstuck. So, when do we know we are stuck where we need to use these reframes to get unstuck?
Yeah, I would say the simplest way is when we feel like we've been trying everything we know how, or we've been doing everything and we just can't break through, whether that's, you know, um, getting to the role we want to get, or going after a goal, or we keep getting rejected for something, career wise. I'm not going to say with, dating or anything, but like we keep not, making it somewhere that we want to with our, work. And I think when we're feeling like, I've tried everything and I just can't get there, that's where I think we know we're stuck. I also mentioned when we're having this dialogue that's very absolute, I never, I always, or this really, why me? It's never going to happen. It's not, this really negative self-talk. It's pretty it's pretty hard to be unstuck when we're having that sort of dialogue. And so when we notice that, and I would suggest for anyone, if you're like, well, am I stuck? How do I know? To actually look across the next few days, check in with yourself every few hours, like, okay, what's my mood? How am I feeling? What's my inner dialogue? And actually to tune in to, well, if you're feeling positive or more down, what interactions have you just had? What thoughts have you had? What kind of activities are you doing? To actually build sort of a map of self-awareness around, what's going on for you internally. And then when you say, yeah, when I do my job, any aspects of it, I feel terrible. I feel stuck. It's saying, okay, well, there's some real things I want to explore. Is it that, I need to figure out, is there a bigger thing? Like I want to change my job? Is it that I want to feel more engaged in what I'm working on, that I need help with something, that I need to have a conversation with my manager? There's a lot there. Once we figure out that we are stuck, then we can start figuring out how we want to take action.
Yeah, and even your title for me becomes a great basis for people to think about it, in that what are the patterns that are potentially contributing to you being
Yeah.
stuck, and reframing those patterns. And who might be some of the people that are contributing to you being stuck. And
Yeah.
as you say, you could be the stories that you're telling, your view could be one of those people that is keeping you unstuck. So that's a great way to think about it. Now, Leah, in addition to your book, Unstuck, are there any leadership resources or practices you recommend for people as they want to think about how they can reframe their thinking and break through?
Yeah. So there's a lot of the book is full of tons of other books and tools and things that I've found valuable because, I think all of that has shaped, well, what are the things that have worked for people? And so I think the book Playing Big by Tara Moore is a fantastic book that helps us, what is the bigger vision I have for myself on what does it mean to play big as opposed to sort of holding myself back and playing small. That's fantastic. I mentioned Brene Brown. I love Gifts of Imperfection is a I think great example. It talks a lot about accountability, which is my favorite subject. The Culture Code is a fantastic book about a lot of the team culture work that I do. Huge resource for that, as is any book from Patrick Lencioni. The Advantage specifically is a fantastic book for teams. Um, I think the real what I try to do when I read any book is to think about, okay, well, how do I want to put this into action? And let me think about like, okay, well, where would this work? What sort of roadblocks would this come up to? And how might I fine tune it to practice this in a situation I'm in? So I think with any time we're reading anything, it's not like the gospel, it's not over yet. It's about thinking, okay, this is one of many tools that I can deploy to really shape how I approach things as a leader. One super quick tool for feedback, I love the situation behavior impact model. I think it's created by the Center of Creative Leadership, which is to talk about the situation in which something occurred, the behavior that's in question, and then the impact it had. Now, when I gave the feedback example, I was sort of using this framework because this allows us to be specific and to keep it about the work, not the person. So this helps us move away from some of that bias, right? Or really quickly see where we can have the conversation like, well, the behavior we're talking about really didn't impact the work. So let's talk about this. This is sounding like more biased feedback, right? So using a feedback framework and really, encouraging your teams to utilize a feedback framework is a helpful way to move to really pull some of the bias out of that as well.
Yeah, that's an outstanding way to approach feedback. And as you said, keep it work focused, behavior focused, as opposed to what a lot of people do, which is unfortunately gets to the individual or the personality.
Yeah.
And that adds a whole host of other issues to it. The other thing you mentioned, I appreciate some of the recommendations you had without understanding where we are headed. And I know one of the reframes that you talk about is with respect to goals. It's hard to know when we are stuck and we want to
Mhm.
get unstuck. So, some reflection on that direction and reframing some of those goals can help us know whether we are stuck and how we should
Yeah.
get unstuck in the direction we want to head.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Leah, how can the audience find out more about your book and connect with you?
Yeah. So visit my website, liagarvin.com, to learn more about my book, my coaching, my organizational consulting. Or I'm launching a course coming up this September. So by November, it'll be out there for a few months now, called the Unstuck Career Accelerator. So you can learn more about that on my website as well. And find me on LinkedIn or Instagram at leah.garvin, or on YouTube. I have a channel, Reframe with Leah, where I talk about little kind of snippets from the book, different reframes, workplace challenges, that offers a lot of tips and tricks as well.
Well, I appreciate those recommendations, the resources, Leah, and your book, Unstuck, Reframe Your Thinking to Free Yourself from the Patterns and People that Hold You Back. Most especially, because there are elements outside of our control. There are systemic issues that need to be addressed. However, there are things within our control. We can get ourselves unstuck. And you share a lot of great reframes in your book and the other resources you mentioned, your site and YouTube, on how to get unstuck. Really appreciate your insights and sharing it with the partnering leadership community. Thank you so much, Lia Garvin.
Thank you so much for having me.